The douce airs of Switzerland have proved agreeable to bourgeois and revolutionary alike, and of all its cities, Locarno, which sits on the northern shores of Lake Maggiore, enjoys a climate that is the most equable. For the last 12 years, it has been the home of Erich Fromm, psychoanalyst and philosopher. 78 years old, Fromm left his native Germany for America with the advent of Hitler, and is the author of many books which dwell upon the human condition. The strict Freudianism of his earlier years was tempered by a feeling that there were external as well as internal currents. In a book called To Have or To Be, published this week, Fromm proposes that there are two styles people use to prove that they are themselves: to add themselves up in terms of what they possess, or to use themselves up in a process of being. Did the first option have disadvantages?
Well, I would say at first, what I have I can lose. In other words, if my sense of identity is based on what I have, on my possessions, if I can say I am what I have, then the question arises, what am I if I lose what I have? Therefore, the sense of identity based on what I have is always threatened. A person is anxiously concerned of not to lose what he has, because he doesn't lose just what he has, he loses his sense of self. If I feel I am what I have and I have nothing anymore, then I am not. And that sense of identity, which is based on to be, is entirely different, because that can never be taken away from me except if I'm insane or in some peculiar circumstances. I feel, I see, I love, I am sad. All these human experiences, which can be expressed in verbs, are human activities which are not dependent, which cannot be lost or destroyed. And therefore, the person whose sense of identity is based on what he is, that is to say, on the expression of his inner faculties, potentialities in the world, or in that sense in what he does, but does not in an outward sense, he does not have the anxiety to lose himself because something may be taken away from him. He is really free from that danger.
It's perfectly clear to me that the being, as you speak of it, is a process of the quittance of self, and you refer to authorities. One of them most admired, the one that you most admire, is Master Eckhart. Another, I think, is Marx. And I'm wondering if the source of your book, your thinking in To Have and or To Be, finds any source in Marx.
Well, in fact, the whole concept of having and being, in the way I find it, stems for me from Marx. Perhaps I can read just one sentence from Marx. He said, "The less you are and the less you express your life, the more you have and the greater is your alienated life." Everything the economist takes from you in the way of life and humanity, he restores to you in form of money and wealth. Now, that is the clearest expression of the difference between having and being as two fundamental and opposite principles. And in fact, it also goes through the whole thought of Marx. Marx is concerned with the question of labor and capital. Now, capital is debt. It's amassed wealth, which then can be used for certain purposes. Labor is a life. And the question for Marx is, what is superior? things or life. And in his criticism of capitalism, I think between the line or lines, or perhaps as a background, there is the question of life or things and the battle for life.
It just passed through my mind as I was reading that whether you also, in condensing reality into the ideas you write down on the page, in incorporating them into your theories, whether in a way you weren't also trying to have reality.
This book I wrote, To Have It To Be, while I am writing it, I'm fully in it. When it's finished, it doesn't interest me anymore. I don't read it anymore. I'm occupied with new ideas. It bores me in the last analysis because it is not, I don't consider it, I don't feel about it. This is my book that I wrote. But so these are ideas which I once wrote down, and I'm not really interested anymore. I'm interested in things I'm thinking now, and also without really, it's making a great difference whether that's something to be published or not to be published.
And then almost as a rebuke for that thought, that first thought, I felt that writing a book was a way of discharging yourself of yourself. Once the book is complete, you've completed the self, and once the self is, in a sense, complete, it can be forgotten.
Actually, in writing a book, one struggles with a problem. One has oneself in some way or another. In writing the book, one clarifies something in oneself, and in publishing it, one hopes that this clarification might be useful to other people who deal with the same problem.
One thing I would like to get absolutely straight. You don't, I'm sure, feel that there are such people who are entirely in the having mode and such people who may be entirely in the being mode. What I get at is that these two qualities coexist in the individual.
Yes, they coexist, and the question is, like in so many other empirical matters, a matter of quantity, in what proportion it exists. Now, if one would imagine a person who is entirely in the mode of having, I would say he would be insane. And if we would imagine a person who is entirely in the mode of being, we would call him a saint. The saints are rarer than the insane people, unfortunately, but most of us are somewhere in between, and it is a matter of empirical analysis, which is not difficult to accomplish, to come to know what proportion, by and large, in a person is in the level of, or in the sector of having, and what in the sector of being.
But it's also clear to me that you feel the bias, the general bias of people is towards the having mode in these days.
Undoubtedly. We live in a society in which is based, everything is based on, in the first place, private property. Private property is, in a way, sacred, and the threat against private property arouses feelings which go far beyond the existing danger that somebody may be deprived of what he has. It is really an attack against his religion, and he develops the kind of same fanatical feeling as if somebody attacks his God or his dogma, his religious dogma. And even those who have no private property to speak of, even for those, the concept of private property is sacred. There was an interesting thing after the First World War. There was in Germany a referendum where the former kings and princes should have their property confiscated for the use of the people, because after all they were responsible for the loss of the war. They had started it. Great majority no, because the concept of private property was so sacred that people rather were going hungry than to touch the private property of the German emperor.
You feel that people who live more by the having style than the being They would allow that to take over, to push out being.
Well, actually, you will find, for instance, that it's very difficult for those people who are essentially living in the having structure of sitting still and doing nothing, or even thinking nothing and not talking. They get very anxious after 5 minutes or earlier, because this actually constitutes one very pure form of being, to be and not to think about anything, and to be quiet and in a peculiar way happy in the act of being. This is me, here I am, I sit, I see the light. And there's no purpose to it. By having is always a purpose, getting something. Being, in its last sense, has no purpose. It is just being. And one could also say in philosophies or religions based on being, being is that which is sacred. Because in a way, being is life, as against acting purposefully to make a living, which most people think about, even if they have nothing, because they have nothing else to think about.
You refer very interestingly to certain ways of having that are by no means obvious ways of having. For instance, you refer to knowledge as a way of having.
Yes. Well, and you can see this very concretely and very often. You see the type of professor who knows everything and tells us nothing, who is completely uninteresting, but he knows everything. And you can find a person who knows very little, but who tells a little story, a little otherwise indifferent story even, with so much aliveness and with so much of his being in it, that the story becomes very interesting and the person becomes interesting, and all there is an expression of being and not an exposition of having knowledge. And I guess everybody knows of his teachers at school and of his professors if he has gone to the university. They're very two different types, and how rare those professors are who do not communicate knowledge as a thing which I give to the other, but which exude aliveness, and the knowledge is almost secondary.
There's a hint of the apocalyptic here and there in the book. I'll just quote from it. You say, for the first time in history, the physical survival of the human race depends on a radical change of the human heart. And you say only a fundamental change in human character can save us from a psychological and economic catastrophe. Is such a change possible, and how?
I believe as long man is man, and one has not yet interfered with his brain, and one has not given him drugs which deprive him of his reason, his power of reasoning. As long that is so, there is the hope that man will do what he has done so far throughout his history, namely prevent his self-destruction as a species. But today we are perhaps, or not perhaps, we are in the situation that by continuing with a powerful technique and a powerless reasoning, we might bring it to a catastrophe which just wipes out the human species, which from a cosmical standpoint would not be a very important event.
Well, you then go on to list the qualities you feel some figure you call the new man should have, and I may say they're the sort of goals of good that no sensible person, no thinking person could deny. But I wonder, when you list them, do you list them feeling you will have more luck in getting them adopted than, say, did Master Eckhart or the Buddha or Jesus?
Well, that is certainly a very good question. And I cannot give a good answer, because I'm very skeptical about having them adopted, and I certainly don't live in the illusion that I say something new which has not been said more powerful and more beautifully by other people. But I think in every situation, provided one is concerned with the future of man, everybody has to be a witness to the truth. An intellectual by writing, if he happens to be a writer, other people in other ways, and there I cannot believe that the percentage of hope counts. In betting, one may not bet on a horse which has only a 5% chance. In saving the life of a person, a whole apparatus is put into action to save a single life. When it goes in the question of life and death, one cannot count percentages. As long as there is life, there is only one thing to do: to shout and to try to make people more aware of where their illusions lead them into destruction.
An interesting proposition you have in the book is what you call a supreme cultural council to advise governments, citizens and politicians on what might be culturally desirable or undesirable. How would we find people adequate to serve on such a council?
Well, I have thought about that. This is not easy. You cannot do it by popular vote. But I think there is a certain consensus among the culturally active forces in the country which would come to a conclusion. I think practically this could be done, for instance, by first choosing 3 people who are undoubtedly belong to the most fruitful representative of a country's culture, from art, science, and so on, or 5. These 5 then would discuss whom they want to adopt, or some such method. But I don't think it's possible, it's impossible, because really there is a great deal of consensus, provided that it is made clear that people should not be excluded or included because they present a certain idea. But I think such a council would have great influence simply by the respect people have for it, provided a kind of group which evokes respect, not only scientifically or artistically, but in some way also humanly. Let us say Einstein was a man who was greatly respected, not just as a scientist, but also as a human being. So was Schweitzer, who was a historian, theologian. He was so many things, great and musician, and great in the things he did. And there was a respect for him as a person which his appearance gave, the atmosphere he radiated gave. After all, people each person has really a certain, to speak in a very old-fashioned term, aura, a certain quality which he projects, his real self. Now, then he can try to hide that and put something else instead, which is fraudulent. But in the long run, I think people have the capacity to distinguish between that which comes from the real person and that fraudulent thing which he has built up. And sometimes the judgment of the people is quite precise. If you take the case of Nixon, before he ever got involved in what he did get involved, there was a general distrust of Nixon, and the sentence that one wouldn't buy a used car from him was used for a long time before there was any reason to have doubts about him. And I think that's the case in many ways. We also, I think, make judgments about another person, but we don't permit ourselves to be aware of them because it's not decent, it is not conventional. You may have a sudden impression, as happened to me, about a person. Suddenly you see in him, this man is a thorough swindler. Well, it has happened to many other people. Was a swindler. The person about whom I thought him was more than a swindler. He was a very destructive kind of a swindler. Well, when I saw him the first time, he talked exactly the language we expected would interest me, and I thought, well, quite a nice young man. But then I saw him one day before he saw that I was coming. And like that, I knew what this man was. And I think we all have this experience. And but we don't dare to be aware of what we know. We repress it. Perhaps I could say one word here about repression. Freud has always, Freud's concept of repression was that we repress our irrational strivings, as he thought mainly of a sexual nature. But I think, especially today, one can see the sexual strivings are not so particularly repressed, but what we do repress is the knowledge of the truth. We know much more than we admit, because if we admit to this knowledge, we are in a very uncomfortable situation, because then we see that most of what we hear is mere swindle, distortion, illusion, and that a word of truth is rare. And so we prefer to repress what we know, what the truth is, what the reality is, and I think that is today a much more important and damaging kind of repression than the one Freud was speaking about, the repression of sexual strivings.